Hello everyone, welcome to the Structural Awards 2025 webinar. We are just about to start as people are joining us. So my name is John Orr. I am chair of the judging panel and professor of structural engineering at the University of Cambridge. The purpose of today really is to give you some insight into what happens behind the scenes. What do the judges get up to once you submit your wonderful projects to us? So we'll give you a bit of information about the judging process, what it's like as a judge, and also what it's like as for me as the chair. And then the bulk of our session, hopefully, will be Q&A. So as we go through today, I hope you're thinking up nice questions to ask myself and the panel, who I will introduce to you in a little bit of time. Before I do that, let me just summarize the entry criteria for the Structural Awards. I'm sure you've all looked at the awards website. There's a lovely guide you can download. There's also FAQs you can read. Just let me highlight a few points, key points from this slide. Your project to be eligible must be completed and open between April 2023 and April 2025. You will submit various documentation for your project. One of those things is a written report, which you must use our template. That template has a word limit. It's a Word file as well, so very easy to put your information into that. You include things like photos, videos, drawings, your carbon calculations, and of course, consent from everybody involved in your project that you're allowed to submit to us. You can't submit projects twice. So if you've submitted a project before, it isn't eligible to be submitted again in 2025. Perhaps most importantly on this slide, the deadline is 5 p.m. British summertime on Monday, the 14th of April, 2025. So not too long to go before you have to submit your work to us. A little bit of housekeeping, just how you can ask us a question. You'll see on your screen a chat window. There's a purple Q&A button. Please type your questions in at any point during today. And when we get to the Q&A session, I will be asking the panel a summary of the questions. I can't promise to get through all of them, but I will try my best to cover as many different topics as we can. So let me now introduce you to our panel. We have with us Will Arnold, who is the head of climate action at the institution. Will is a fellow of the institution and is both a chartered structural engineer and chartered environmentalist. I'm sure many of you on this call will know Will by name, at least, for his work on climate action and all the wonderful things the institution is doing around embodied carbon, plus in the UK, things like Part Z and the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. Our second panel member is Catherine Cashel. Catherine is Professor of Structural Engineering at UCL, University College London. She's also a chartered engineer and a fellow of both the IStructE and the Institution of Civil Engineers. So welcome to you both. I'll just stop sharing this screen. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the key attributes that all the projects will be looking at and writing their reports around. And for the audience, this is really just some information about those 4 Ps. And I'm going to ask Catherine and Will to talk about the Ps. And I'm going to start with Planet. So Will, can you just give us a little outline of Planet? What's it all about?
Sure, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Morning, afternoon, depending on where in the world you are, I suppose. So yeah, Planet. So the Planet attribute, I guess, comes from the starting point, which is that all 4 attributes are there to talk about the sort of outcomes of our work, the outcomes of our project, the impact of our projects. And clearly, we care about the impact on the wider planet. That's part of the institution's 2 tenets of safe and sustainable design. The first thing to say about this attribute is that obviously embodied carbon is quite a big part of this, and this will now be the 5th year where we've mandated the submission of a carbon calculation as part of the entry process. Now we make this quite straightforward for entrants. There is an awards version of the structural carbon tool that you get given when you download the sort of application pack. It's only got 1 or 2 tabs in it. It's fairly straightforward. And if this is the first time you've done a carbon calculation, which hopefully it won't be, but if it is, that's fine. Then it's actually pretty straightforward. It's basically a spreadsheet that asks you for some basic material quantities and a couple of key stats about the project, and the tool does the rest. But for engineers with a deeper understanding of the embodied carbon footprint of their project, you can update things like carbon factors, transport emissions, and so on to better reflect the reality of the emissions associated with the project that you're entering. And then judges look at these calculations and the numbers that come out of them as part of understanding the bigger picture about the impact of each project. That's not to say that a high carbon project can't win a structural award, and of course many do. There is a time and a place to use material, as it were, but it's really useful as a judge to understand what the impact of each project is, how lightly or heavily a project has touched the earth. And obviously, if it does have a heavy carbon footprint, we want to understand why that is and whether there are other reasons why the project should win an award. And the last thing I should say, John, is that, of course, this is about more than just embodied carbon. So we're also on the lookout for projects that push circular economy principles, they minimize waste, they trial new materials that benefit biodiversity, they've implemented regenerative design techniques, co-creation, working with community, all of those sorts of things. Projects that demonstrate alignment with things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the institution's hierarchy of net zero design, they always that always helps sort of communicate the planet angle to us. And of course, we're always on the lookout for projects that respond to local context, to introduce things like durability, resilience, and adaptability into the future, because we care about long-term sustainability, not just in the here and now. Probably leave it at that, John.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil, very much. The second P that I'm going to talk about is profession. And really, profession is asking the question, how has this project advanced our structural engineering profession, or the structural engineering profession? And I thought about this in two ways. The first of those is having a positive impact on the structural engineering industry. So here we're looking at projects that demonstrate innovation and creativity in such a way that the project influences other projects. And you might call that a lighthouse project. So it's showing how something can be done and showing how your project not only does that thing, but uses it to influence how others are working. So influencing the profession that way, opening doors, paving the way for other people, that kind of idea. And the second part of it is really looking at the reputation of our profession in society. A lot of people don't really understand what structural engineering is or what we do, but we are very important in making everything work that everybody uses. And projects that demonstrate that positive social contribution and showing the role of structural engineering and achieve that is really important. And maintaining that profile, for example, could be something that you do that helps make our profession appeal to younger people or diverse backgrounds to join us as engineers. So thinking about the career paths that people have. So those are the two main parts of profession for me. One further thing that I'd encourage everyone to do is to go on the iStructE Structural Awards website and look at previous projects and previous winners. And there's a few here that I picked out. So one example of a profession-related project is the Brighton Corn Exchange, quite a high-profile project, heritage status, and the team there really helped raise awareness about what they're doing to retain and restore existing buildings. So I'll leave that one at that and move to process. So Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about process, please?
Sure. Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as Will said, depending on where you are. It's nice to be here today and to talk about the structural awards. So yeah, the process criterion is, I guess, the one of the 4 Ps, which has always been at the core of the structural awards, in the sense that I would view it really as a consideration of how a project was conceived, designed, and delivered. So we might evaluate things like novel methods or clever structural solutions to some sort of a challenge, using effective collaborations, employing efficiencies, but everything that goes from the conception of a project right through to the final outcome. So I would say we're always looking for projects that are structurally excellent. I don't think that's ever changed with the awards. So that would be maybe the traditional process of undertaking a structural design, but also looking at well-executed projects from start to finish, and those that work well and collaboratively with the surrounding environment in which they are being built or constructed. So looking maybe at a little bit more detail of some of the key aspects under this criterion which you might want to consider, and this is not exhaustive or even essential, it's just more of a sort of a random list of things that come to mind from previous years. So things like innovation in design and construction, so using some sort of a new or novel solution, and an advanced material or a clever analysis or construction method. Increasingly, I would say we're looking a little bit at efficiency and buildability and how well project kind of optimizes use of resources. And obviously some of these P's kind of overlap in places. So that might be one. Collaboration and coordination. I remember from last year that was something that came up quite a bit in some of the winning projects. So things that seem to just work really well together. So different disciplines working together to come up with the best solution. So that could be the structural engineer working with architects, contractors, other stakeholders, local people, for example, looking at creative solutions due to some sort of site challenge or engineering challenge. So I think by evaluating process, we're trying to ensure that structural engineering is not just about the end result, but also about how that result is achieved. And a well-managed, innovative process might lead to efficient and sustainable, impactful solutions. So I think that's probably it on process, John.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. And the last of our 4 Ps is people, which I'll just briefly talk about. People is really asking the question, how your project is demonstrating excellence in terms of its impact on the people who are involved in the project or the end users. So there's lots of different angles to people, depending on what you think is the most important thing that your project has done. So for example, you might think about how your project has shown collaborative design, some novel kind of procurement, or how you've added value to a client or stakeholders. Or you could think about the people who are actually using the project, the communities, the end users. Perhaps you've done some local upskilling, for example. And so very many different perspectives on what people can mean. And the judges are then assessing those against the evidence you provide. And I say that because we really like to see evidence of how the people have been impacted by a project. So whichever avenue you go down, provide us with nice evidence as to your success. So looking back at the projects that I think illustrate this really well, the one I chose was Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, RICA. So this is, very briefly, it's a campus project. There's loads of buildings, 69 buildings, I think, and it's a model for agriculture and training. And one thing the project did is maximizing human handprint. So they were celebrating craft and culture in local fabrication. This is a project based in Rwanda. There's a lot of available people to do this kind of work. And the team really embraced that particular cultural situation in a really beautiful way. So this is people because the design is fundamentally linked to the people around the project. It prioritized jobs, employment, upskilling people, bringing new construction techniques and training. Other examples from this project were spending a lot of the budget within a fairly tight radius of the site. And the project also showed some good characteristics around the gender balance of the leadership of the project. I think 58% of the project leadership was female. So that's the 4 Ps. So please do read the entry guide and the FAQs as well. We've just gone over them very briefly. There's lots of pointers and bullet points on the iStrate website. But I want now to move on to the perhaps more interesting bit for you watching, which is the judging process. What goes on behind the scenes? What do Catherine and Will get up to when they are reviewing projects? Before I move to them, I'll just give you a very brief overview of the actual process. So the judging panel is made up of about 21 people from all around the world, chosen for their expertise to ensure that we have a diversity of views on the panel. Typically, these are senior leaders in their respective fields We also invite every year the winner of the Young Engineers of the Year award. I should say at this point, I'm heavily indebted to all the judges because they do a huge amount of work, and it's really wonderful for me as chair to see this process happening. The judging process is broadly split into 2 stages. First of all the entries go out for their review. One judge typically reviews 20 projects, and each project gets reviewed by 5 judges. So we get a lot of opinions on each project. There's a lot of redundancy in our system. We get really thorough reviews of what's going on. In that first round, the judges will choose up to 6 projects that they think should be shortlisted. And we then have essentially a long meeting, a one-day meeting, where our job is to go through every project and have a technical discussion about whether the project should be shortlisted or not. And in that situation, my main job is ensuring that we do have enough time to speak to every project, because we want to give everyone a fair hearing, guiding discussion, and getting to a consensus decision. Once we come up with that shortlist, those shortlisted projects are reviewed again, and we have a second meeting to decide on the 10 or so winners. We don't have a set number, it's usually about 10 winners that we think best meet those criteria that the panel and I have just spoken about. We then take our 10 winners and choose the Supreme Award winner. In that entire process, my aim as chair is to ensure we have really good discussion, the right length of time, and a consensus decision. I'm sure you can imagine with each project being reviewed by 5+ judges, each with their own background and expertise, there's always differing views. And it's through that discussion process that we iron out exactly which projects are demonstrating excellence against our criteria. Okay, so now let's actually see what it's like as a judge. So, Catherine, can I come to you? Can you maybe give us a behind-the-scenes view of the judging process? What happens? What do you do? What's it like?
Sure, thanks, John. Yeah, I think you've summed it up pretty well in terms of the process that we go through. I'm not sure I have anything kind of new to add, except maybe to reinforce that one of the most striking things, a couple of things are quite striking to me through the process. One is the diversity of people on the panel. So we often start off with relatively, I won't say extreme, but different views on relative merits. And then there's a really quite thorough discussion where one side tries to convince the other, and it normally works. So I think reaching consensus is normally, I think in most cases, we reach a pretty good consensus, usually through discussion on the relative merits against those 4 Ps in most cases. I guess as well, the other thing is, having said that it's a very diverse group, I also feel that we as a panel share a common goal, which is not only to recognize the best in our profession, but really to celebrate it. So I think we're constantly conscious of like, we want to celebrate, like, beyond structural engineering, some of the amazing things and projects that are going on at all sorts of different levels and scales. And that's a common goal. I feel that comes across quite strongly during our discussions. So yeah, I guess one other thing I can mention is it's really quite enjoyable. I mean, again, the diversity, we all work in our little pockets of structural engineering, and to come out and to see some of the amazing things that are going on, not just around wherever it is that we live, but also around the world, and different scales of project, is really quite inspiring, I think. I find it a quite inspirational, time-consuming, but inspirational process.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Will, how about you? Can I ask the same question? Any thoughts on the process, how it goes for you? I mean, you're also an institution employee, so whilst most of the judges are in practice, you've got maybe a different perspective as an employee of the institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose maybe I come to the judging meetings with the sort of the key values and tenets of my employer drilled into my brain slightly more strongly than others. I'd second what Catherine says about the sort of passionate debates that we have on these projects, which I find really fun, and I find I learn quite a lot. I always feel quite humbled by the sort of seniority and experience of some of the judges who are in the room, who have worked for decades on some really hard engineering and some really impactful projects. So it's always quite interesting and fun to be able to sort of debate the relative merits of different projects with them. I think one of the other things I really, for me, I think is a real positive about the process that we go through is that there's no real set requirements on numbers. There's no sort of quota to fill of, well, we must have at least 5 bridges within this, and we must have at least 5 projects. There's none of that with the way we do the awards at the moment. Projects are based on their own merit. They're judged on their own merit, rather. And the question that we're basically debating as judges is this individual project good enough? Does it exemplify what's great about this profession, about structural engineering? And that means that we are debating projects on their own merit rather than necessarily debating them against each other, which I've always found to be quite a nice way to sort of approach this. And as a result, it means that I think we've probably ended up with different numbers of winners in the past few years. We've definitely ended up with slightly different length shortlists. We aim for a rough number that's in the sort of same ballpark. But we don't have to say, right, stop it, we can't have any more winners. If your project is good enough, we want to be able to award it with that. And that's a really sort of rewarding thing to be part of.
Thanks, Will. Perfect. I think if I was submitting a project, I would be wondering what makes an entry stand out? What really kind of catches the judge's eye? So I wonder if you can think, maybe Catherine, I'll come to you first. When you're reviewing those entries, you've got a big pack of information in front of you. Are there any key things that really make projects stand out? Any tips you could give our audience on convincing you as a judge that they've done something really exciting? You're muted. Catherine, you're muted.
I think maybe I should have a go whilst Catherine was. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Classic. So for me, when I'm reviewing those first 20 projects that come through, the first thing I usually do is just sort of read them all one at a time and make some really basic notes just about what the project is. And I find that during that process, some start to bubble to the top, and it's not always obvious why. Interestingly, on the sort of first pass through, I then do a second pass where I go through them quite logically, and I try and write notes against each of the 4 attributes, the 4 Ps, as you call them, John, where they excel. And I think something I've noticed over the last few years is the projects that stand out, they rarely exemplify all 4 attributes. It's really rare that happens, and for us as judges, that's absolutely okay. What we're looking for, and for me, what I'm looking for, I suppose, is a project that can say, actually, in this attribute, we did this really amazing thing, and it was this. And quite often, it's maybe 2 rather than just 1 of the attributes, but it's rarely 4. One of my favourite examples from last year was 66 Oxford Terrace, which is a residential block of flats in New Zealand that has suffered from earthquake damage during the Christchurch earthquakes, and it needed strengthening in order to bring it up to current seismic standards. And of course, the business as usual approach would have just been to knock it down and build a new block of flats to modern standards. But instead of doing that, the engineers were able to demonstrate that you could save the current building by effectively changing its seismic behavior and its stability system entirely. So they took the concrete core, which is 37 meter high reinforced concrete walls, drilled 37 meter long holes down through the middle of those core walls, and added post-tensioning tie rods down them, and changed it from a ductile RC core into a rocking and damped rocking core to sort of dissipate energy in an earthquake. And I remember when I read that, I just thought, bloody hell, I mean, that's like really quite brave and daring, done with engineering excellence and done with the purpose of trying to save this building. And so for me, it was really obvious straight away that in terms of planet, from a sort of carbon footprint and use of resources point of view, and a process perspective in terms of doing that clever engineering to get the solution to work, it straight away stood out for me. And I think that's, for many of the judges, that's quite a sort of like common thing. You read the reports and 1 or 2 of those attributes jump out to you straight away, and you think that's where we want to celebrate this project. I'd say on the flip side of it, a common mistake that you see from some entries is people trying to post-justify having met all 4 of the attributes, where really, you're wasting word count on one or two of those. And as a judge, we would be absolutely fine if you sort of put that to one side and just focused on what was great about your building or your bridge or your project.
Yeah, that's great advice, Bill. Thanks. Catherine, can I come back to you? Yeah.
I'm so sorry. My mute button just disappeared, and I was having a mad panic talking to myself. Anyway, it's like bringing stress back from 2020, and we first started doing all of this. Anyway, yeah. So I mean, Will again captured it really well. But what are we looking for? For me, I quite like a story to be told. Like I like the beginning to end of a project. I quite like. I mean, again, maybe it's because I'm quite simple. I like pictures. I like images. I like to see drawings and sketches, and how a project has gone from kind of conception right through to completion. And I really do like. We all love the big, massive projects that the landmark ones that we all know about. But I also quite like the ones that really fit into its setting and have really tried to talk about the wider context, not just the structural engineering excellence, but also how that has kind of interwoven with the local society or whatever it is, local stakeholders, I guess, in generic terms. So, yeah, what are we looking for? The whole picture, all of it. We're looking for all of it and some of it. It's hard to kind of sum it up, isn't it?
I think if I join those two things together, really it's kind of a narrative. A really good story, right? A really good story and narrative, but that doesn't try and do too much. Yeah. So you tell us one really great thing that your project did, rather than try and cover everything and put in loads of information that actually is good, but it's not going to win you an award. Whereas a report which is saying this project has done this one really amazing thing, and I'm going to tell you about it in really great detail and a really great story. Those reports for me really work well. So for the audience, I mean, it's kind of obvious. Is remember you're telling us a story, and keeping that story as simple and detailed as you can is really great. So Will, if I can come back to you to think about emerging trends. So you've been on the panel for some time. What kind of trends are you seeing in recent years? Where do you see submissions going? Are there any things you're really excited about that you hope to see in future submissions?
So I think we, in particular in the last year or two, have seen these really clear trends towards there being more natural materials, more global projects, and more reuse projects. So if I just look at the 11 winners from 2024, a third of those have significant amounts of natural materials used within them. 2/3 of them are based in countries other than the UK. Which for those of you who are listening from outside the UK, that might be obvious, but many of our members work in the UK, so maybe less obvious to them. And 2/3 of those projects had elements of retrofit to them. And I think what's interesting is that's not through any sort of deliberate intervention on behalf of the judges of saying we want to celebrate retrofit or anything like that. I think it comes from a change in what our members are valuing when they're putting their projects in. They're maybe more likely to enter a retrofit project than they might have been, say, 10 years ago, because of the changing climate around about climate change and what our architects and our clients, our collaborators are asking for. But the other point to note is that I think what has then stayed constant through this, even with those changes, has been the sort of level of technical excellence. So if you look at the award winners from last year and you look at some of those retrofit projects or those natural material projects, they are still amazing from a sort of technical engineering ingenuity perspective. If you look at last year's Supreme Award winner, which is a museum complex in Tibet, which is based on the retrofit of, I think, sort of 4 or 5 different buildings, all with different structural systems, quite complex and intricate. And the engineering solutions to each of those buildings was quite different to each other. What that's doing from a process perspective is really impressive, alongside it happening to be a retrofit project. So I think we've seen these trends, but we've also seen this underlying undercurrent of engineering difficulty and excellence that sort of stayed there throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Catherine, if we think about sort of why we have the award, how do you feel that the awards contribute to some of the broader profession and industry? What do people get out of being part of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably at the core of why anyone would enter, really. I mean, I guess the obvious thing is that they're a celebration. They're a celebration of excellence and setting benchmarks and pushing boundaries and literally sort of in a nice way boasting about doing a job well as a structural engineer. I think in the broader sense, I'm hoping that the awards inspire engineers. So I know certainly, like we've touched on it in earlier questions, but as a judge, I mean, we'll use the word kind of humbled. I mean, we're humbled often when we sit on the panel. I'm often humbled when I look at some of the work that colleagues and fellow structural engineers are doing around the world, and the solutions they manage to come up with. So I think they do serve as a kind of an inspiration and encouragement towards continuous improvement and development in design and materials and sustainability and in everything. I think as well, the awards themselves, they are a showcase. They are a way for us, as I said, to celebrate. And I don't know if we're all that good at that naturally as structural engineers. It's not something that we don't tend to shout from the rooftops as loudly as maybe some other professions when we do something well or declaring our achievements. So I think the awards provide quite an important platform actually for us to do that. And there's nothing quite as good, maybe this is just me, but I don't think there's anything quite as good as getting recognition from our peers. So if someone who you think really knows what they're doing in structural engineering terms tells you that you've done a good job, then that's quite nice. So I think it's quite good for us to do that and to provide that platform for each other, to celebrate each other, and also to show the world some of the amazing stuff that's going on.
No, absolutely. And sort of bringing those two together, if you think of Will's point about learning to love old buildings, I mean, a lot of that learning to love them is incredibly detailed structural engineering, knowing how stuff works. And a big challenge in the UK and much of Europe and much of the world is how we keep stuff going for longer. And if the public understand more what we're doing, kind of raises our profile. So I agree, it's all kind of tied together. Great. So I made a note here to talk to you all about what it's like as the chair of the panel. I think I covered most of the points before in my sort of introduction. But I think I just reiterate the main role that I have is sort of guiding and achieving consensus between very strong, very detailed opinions. And it's that deep technical discussion that I really enjoy. So I review all the projects. So I look through them. I know what's going on. I try and guide the discussions as best I can. And it's always a really enjoyable, albeit quite hectic meeting, getting through all of the projects in a relatively short space of time. And at the end, although we do have, as one of you mentioned, sometimes we disagree on points, often it's through discussion that we come to understand, actually, we probably agree and can arrive at that consensus. So it's a really enjoyable job for me. So I'm very privileged to be able to do this and sit on this side, and again, very grateful to all the judges. So I've finished in exactly the right amount of time to give us 25 minutes for Q&A. So I will encourage everyone in the room, please, to ask questions so that we can have some Q&A. We did have some questions submitted prior to the event. And the first one here, I don't have a name, from Brazil, this question. So will videos be accepted as part of the submission? And I'll answer that one very quickly. Yes, you can submit videos. The best way to do that is to provide sort of Dropbox link or some kind of online link. I think that's the preferred method. And the second part of the question is, how should the Global South submission build their documentation or strategy? So Will, I wonder if you could talk about, are there any differences for somebody in the Global South submitting to these structural awards that they should bear in mind?
So I'd start by saying that in terms of the process, it's exactly the same no matter where in the world you're entering from. And one of the key changes we made 3 years ago when we revamped the awards process was to change the way you report. So the main bit of documentation is a sort of report about the project that you submit to us. And it always used to be that it was up to you how you assembled that report. And what we had realised over time was that some firms were willing to sort of put more money behind the marketing of that report. So we got some very shiny, glossy reports from some firms, and others gave us a sort of Word documents, and that's immediately introduced a bias. So we've removed that by giving you this Word document that's a sort of pro forma that you fill in, and it has a space for you to describe the project in general, and then spaces for you to describe or respond to each attribute, most of which are optional. I think only the planet attribute is one that we mandate that you respond to, and the word count is an overall word count for the documents as a whole. So if you are based in the global south and you're thinking, well, hang on, how am I going to compete with firms in the global north that might have more money behind them and so on? Actually, it's a relatively lightweight thing that we're asking you to do. You download the Word document, you describe your projects as best as you can, and you send that over to us, and you can upload some images and some drawings and stuff as well as part of the documentation. You obviously complete the carbon tool, which again is just an Excel file, so you can fill that in quite quickly. And like John just said, if you want to put videos in, you're more than welcome to do so. I think one of the sort of key differentiators I'd say is we've got to remember that actually, the majority, when we talk about the so-called global south, and it's not a term I'm particularly fond of, least of all because it's geographically inaccurate. But also, it doesn't really help to try and differentiate the world into two groups. And most of the world live in what's been termed the global south. So it's something like 75% of the world's population. So what the question's really saying, if I live in most of the world, what do I have to do with my submission? And I think when you frame it like that, hopefully that would help encourage you to just write about your projects and give it in to us. And I think what we've found in the past is that often projects in lower economically developed countries, in parts of the world where maybe there are less engineers around or less architects around, there's less of that profession being built up. We see a lot of the sort of the people and the planet sides quite often come to the fore in those projects. And John gave the example of the Rwanda Institute of Conservation Agriculture. And the benefit of that project of working in Rwanda was that the engineers were able to engage all the way through the supply chain and work out construction methods that would really help encourage local labour and local training and all those things John described before, in ways that maybe would be harder to do in some countries in the global north, where there would be more sort of hurdles in the way of that kind of thing. So I think, to sort of summarise, I'd say that the entry form's the same. We've tried to make it as lightweight and simple as possible, and it's up to you to tell us what is best about your project. And I think that if you are working in the global south, that's likely to lead to things that will make your project quite unique when compared to projects in the richer countries of the world.
Brilliant, thanks, Will. So the next question is asking, can we talk a little bit about material efficiency? So I think I'll interpret that to say, if we think about a design philosophy of putting the right material in the right place at the right time, how can an entrant show that in their submission? So Catherine, can I ask you if you've got any thoughts on material efficiency, how that's demonstrated in a submission, how important it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult to totally pinpoint these things because, like we've said before, some projects will do really, really strongly. So they'll present a beautiful discussion on exactly why they've chosen a particular material and how they've used it well, and it's quite clever. Whereas another project may not have that emphasis, but has other strengths. So I wouldn't say any of the things almost that we've talked about as a single thing are kind of absolutely vital in order to win a structural award. But material efficiency, certainly, I mean, going back to what you just said, John, in terms of using the right material to do the right thing structurally in the right location, either in a building or geographically or everything else, is sort of fundamental to good structural engineering, you would imagine. So it should be at the core, but I wouldn't say it needs to be the emphasis of a report necessarily. But certainly, I guess that's an area that maybe has changed in relatively recent years, that there is now greater emphasis on making sure that we use materials, carefully and dutifully, and that we don't just, throw a whole load of concrete at something for want of a better excuse, although there might be times when that is the right solution. So I would say everything can be justified so long as it's the decision making has been appropriate along the way. And I think the community at large, often through some of the work that Will and the institution have done, but the structural engineering community at large are now much more conscious of these responsibilities, and have stood up to that responsibility pretty well. So I think presented in that context, almost everything is open.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think I'd just add two things to that. One of them is because you have to submit the structural carbon tool, and that's got to essentially account of your material, the material in your building, it will become evident from that whether you're using very little material or very little or way too much as compared. So, for example, if you're doing a steel frame building, we kind of know roughly what a steel frame building would be if it's well designed, and we can make those comparisons. So in terms of demonstrating it, you have got the structural carbon tool, which is sort of related to material use. The other thing I would say is when you're writing, if you're writing a report and you're trying to say that this is a really materially efficient building and you've done lots of optimization, then I guess prove it is what I was trying to say. So show it with numbers, show it with a comparison to a reference class. If you're designing a hospital, how does this compare to other hospitals? If you're designing a skyscraper, how does it compare to others? Is it really, it's easy to say something's efficient, but demonstration of it with numbers, evidence is really useful as well. Or you could talk about how much material have you saved by switching from material X to material Y, or from switching from beams and bending to nice shell structure floors, those kinds of things. Really explaining and evidence is really important in that kind of context for me. There is one question that's just come in on the Q&A. So, Will, can I ask you this one? Is there any weighting given to the different attributes that have been mentioned?
So the short answer is no. We, as I said before, we are assessing projects based on their own strengths. And if your strength is in one attribute only, that is no greater or stronger in attributes than the others. We don't put an emphasis on one over the others at all. But I think what is interesting is that often we end up in a discussion about the trade-off between different things and where the relative strengths are on different projects. So an example of this, and this kind of comes back to the material efficiency discussion that was just being had, would be a few years ago. It was two projects. There were two arts projects that had been submitted, where the judges, I remember there being quite a long discussion about this. The judges felt that these were quite eye-catching projects. They were clearly, they were being featured on the front of architectural magazines and things like that. And they had some big structural challenges behind them to make them work. So from a process point of view, they were quite impressive in terms of the way that the engineers had responded to that. But the carbon footprint of these projects was something like 8 or 10 times what we would consider a typical building to me. I mean, they had astronomically high embodied carbon footprints. And whilst we don't do a sort of third-party review of the carbon tool submissions that come in, we don't go out and measure quantities ourselves to check that they're right. It does give us a really good feel of the sort of impact of this project. And so the debate became about the sort of value for carbon, as it were. So these two projects have this huge impact on emissions and therefore on the future of life on our planet, but at the same time were these very impressive projects from a technical perspective. And actually, in the end, the chair, John's predecessor at the time, so it was Tim Eibel, the chair, wanted to guide us towards a consensus where we agreed as a judging panel what side of the fence these projects landed on, and we did not shortlist them in the end because we just felt that we couldn't justify that impact. So that's not to say that we decided in that instance that planet had more importance than process, but it's to say that in that instance we felt that the value given to humanity through technical prowess and so on was not sufficient to make up for the damage done to humanity through the emissions of those projects. So we end up in these positions from time to time, and it's quite good fun and it's quite interesting. But I think, the short answer is no. It depends on the project. You tell us what's great about that project, and we all debate it in the round alongside other things.
Thanks, Will. I'll move on to another question which perhaps I'll come back to you, Catherine, for this one. Are there any particular solutions or themes that stand a better chance of being shortlisted this year?
Oh my God. Wouldn't that be nice if we could just, that would narrow the entry field too much. Absolutely not, would be my gut answer to that. Yeah, I was actually just thinking as Will was talking and through our discussion this morning that one of the most amazing things to me personally about the structural awards, I'm going slightly off piste, but is the diversity of project. So I would dare not say anything which would limit that for entry. Yeah, I mean, I think we're more open-minded as a panel than I would have thought we would be before I was on the panel, if that makes sense. It's fairly kind of open game. We get all sorts of projects, and it's quite incredible some of the projects that get shortlisted through the discussions that we've talked about that maybe wouldn't have been on half the panel's radar to begin with. So no, I wouldn't dare to limit, I think, personally, at this point.
Absolutely. And this really comes back to the strength about having these 4 attributes, right? So we're not pigeonholed into categories or certain typologies, structural typologies. And really the panel can just choose the best stuff that comes in. So there aren't any, I completely agree. So we can leave that one there.
Just to jump in and say that I think one thing I've noticed in the last few years is there's usually there's over-representation of larger projects and under-representation of smaller ones. And I think we are keen to celebrate the sort of breadth of the profession. So I'd say that it's not a theme that we are asking people to enter on as such, but we are on the lookout for smaller projects that do the same amazing things that we've been talking about through this. And so if you've been working on one of those smaller projects and it was completed in the last 2 years, as per the timeframe John mentioned, I would encourage you to enter it, because we are looking to be able to demonstrate our profession's greatness across all scales, and it's bread and butter for most structural engineers, sort of domestic scale projects. So please show them to us and tell us why they're great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Will. That's a really great point. And if I just move on to perhaps the last question, I haven't seen any more coming in on the screen. So if you've got a question, please chuck it in now. So this question from the USA. Can master's project dissertations be submitted and projects executed when in the previous employment? So perhaps I'll just answer that myself. So the main thing here is the time frame of the project. So within the 2023-2025, as Will just said, and also the consent of people involved in the project. Projects are typically structures, buildings. I'm not sure what the master's dissertation is being referred to there, but if everyone agrees that it can be submitted, then sure. Good. We have another question. So, Edward, I think your question is best answered by the events team. I think the answer is probably no, since your project was opened in 2022 and therefore is not eligible. But you may want to drop an email to the events team just to confirm that. That's my gut reaction to that. Since it was opened outside of the window of April 2023 to April 2025, therefore not eligible. Good.
John, can I jump in very quickly? Sorry, it was just in the last question when you were talking about what can and can't enter, and Will was talking about smaller projects. Just to flag that last year, I remember a lot of discussion, and I think a final winner of an award was actually an almost like a do nothing project. So it was the Smithfield roof, if you remember, and we had a lot of debate, and I was one of the people whose opinion completely changed during that debate, because I was like, we cannot award someone who's actually done nothing. And then it turns out that they've done a huge amount of analysis and detailed work in order to justify doing nothing. So, I mean, that really exemplifies, I think, the kind of the broad range of type of project that can enter. I'm not sure about the master's dissertation, like you said, but certainly a sort of do nothing physically, but do a lot analytically or in structural engineering terms can still win an award, right?
Yeah,
maybe build nothing.
Build
do a
something.
lot.
Yeah, not do nothing. Yes,
And
yes,
there was another project a few years before, if you remember, the Elizabeth Line gantries on new rail line in London going from east to west, and the engineers involved in that had basically been approached by a client who thought they were going to have to replace 500 overhead gantries. And by the time they'd finished all their analysis, that I think they had to strengthen 50 of them and replace less than 10. And it was quite amazing. And again, same conversation Catherine described, where we all sat there going, they didn't actually really build very much. But wasn't that great, right? And the engineering difficulty that went into proving that was amazing. So yeah, that is broad, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Thanks, both. The idea of do nothing, I think, is better for, as you say, build nothing, and really looking for the technical expertise of the structure engineer to make that happen, and all the good climate-related stuff that happens when you use less material. Good. So we haven't got any more questions coming in. So perhaps we kind of come to the closing anyway. Maybe some closing thoughts from you both. Is there any final thing you want to say that you haven't said already, or any piece of advice that you would give to somebody submitting a project? Will, I'll come to you first.
I guess the thing that I don't think I mentioned yet, but I'm keen to have people bear in mind, is that what we're interested in is what you and the engineering team, structural engineering team, have done for this project. So we're not, for example, on people, we're not interested if the architecture itself had a big impact on local people. I mean, of course, that's a great thing. But that's not something that the structural engineer may have influenced. But if the structural engineer can tell a story about how actually, we as engineers were able to bring local benefit because we created these training programs, or because we changed construction methods to reflect local practice, whatever it is we did as structural engineers, that's where the excellence is that we're looking for as judges. And I think that some of the best projects that we've seen have just told this story where you think, wow, if that engineer had not been present on that project, it would have been a very different scheme. My favourite example of this is the Mary Ward Centre. It was one of last year's winning projects, and originally this was a central London old, derelict, crumbly, not very nice looking building that was due to be knocked down because an engineer had said that there was no way you could save it. And the engineers who ended up winning the structural award were basically a different team who had been put onto this project by the client, who had said, actually, I think maybe we can. And they did, they told this amazing story of the real nitty gritty engineering they had to do and all the site investigations they had to do to prove it. And it was just really obvious to us as judges that without those engineers present on that project, it would have looked entirely different. You would have knocked it down, built something brand new, really run of the mill. So we're interested in what you have done, what the structural engineers have done, and how that is aligned with our 4 attributes.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Phil. And Catherine, and it's the same question.
Yeah, I mean, we've covered. I'm going to start repeating myself, so I'll keep it short, except to say, I don't know. I think again, just it's a little bit repetitive, but I would tell anyone to give us a reason to celebrate what you have done. So anything that you feel, where you've gone just beyond the norm, or you've done something that's just a cool solution, we're very happy to celebrate, and give us a reason to celebrate it. And yeah, it's there. And I would say that particularly from a global perspective, a lot of the kind of innovations that happen in different parts of the world, we can kind of spread that message and use this as an opportunity to share. But yeah, I'm only going to repeat myself now. So.
That's good. That's brilliant. Thanks. So just as we're finishing, we've had some questions coming in, of course. So we have minutes left. Why not? Let's look at them. So can we talk a bit more about gender balance in project leadership? So, I mean, I can talk about gender balance. I think the example I gave under people was specific to a project example where the team was trying to get a good gender balance in those involved in the project. It's not mandatory. There's no target on that. It's just a thing that worked in that particular project. That was a really good example. I don't know if either of you have any other comments about gender balance.
I'd say that it sits under, this sits under the people attributes. If you can demonstrate how on your project, steps have been taken to increase the diversity across all aspects of it in terms of those leading the project, those leading the work, then, we're really interested to hear from that, because that's the sort of engineering excellence that we want to encourage more of.
Yeah.
Good.
I would just say as well, it's probably broader than just gender, right? It's all sorts of diversity aspects.
Yeah, good. Okay, right, we'll leave it there. So thank you to Catherine and Will for all your wonderful insights and joining me on this panel today. Thank all of you at home or work, wherever you happen to be, for listening to us. If you do have any further questions which haven't been answered today, then please drop us an email, events@istruct.org. We'll have a recording of this online in the next few days, and if you want to watch it again, you're very welcome to. Structured Awards website is there. You can also just type that into Google. Please have a look, submit your entries by the deadline. And one final thing, date for your diary. We will celebrate the whole process and the winners and supreme winner at an awards dinner on the 14th of November 2025 in London. So thank you all for attending. Have a great day. Bye-bye.